Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, over the weekend, residents in Camden were evacuated from their homes in high-rise buildings which have failed fire safety tests following the fire at Grenfell Tower 2 weeks ago. So what do we know so far about the safety of the buildings affected? Well, last week, the government started assessing the cladding on 600 buildings. So far, they have tested 60 buildings in 14 council areas, all of which have failed the fire safety tests. The aluminium composite material panels were fitted during a recent £10 million refurbishment of Grenfell Tower to improve insulation in the building. These cladding panels have a foam core made of polyethylene surrounded by 2 sheets of aluminium, which is flammable. Official building regulations recommend that only non-combustible cores are used on buildings over 18 metres tall. There is also an air gap between these panels to allow moisture to evaporate, but safety experts say this may have caused a chimney effect in directing the flames up the building. To reduce this effect, fire barriers should be installed between panels, but it is unclear whether these barriers were fitted in Grenfell Tower. In addition, Grenfell was not fitted with a sprinkler system during the refurbishment, although there is no legal requirement for local authorities to install one in older buildings. And the Housing Minister, Alok Sharma, was on BBC Breakfast this morning, and here's what he had to say.
We have put in place a very clear process to make sure that buildings that are identified with a particular type of aluminium cladding are tested. We have test facilities that are able to test 100 samples a day, and that can be extended if required. And we're making sure that as soon as we find out that a building has failed and has got cladding which is non-compliant, immediately the local authority is informed, the local fire service is informed, and they go to the building and do the right checks. And clearly, as you've just said, in the case of Camden, where it wasn't just cladding, but there were multiple other failures when it came to fire safety, people had to be evacuated. I have nothing but admiration for the way that people have dealt with that, who've been affected by this.
Alok Sharma there. Well, we're joined now from Broadcasting House by the BBC's Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons. Tom, welcome to the Daily Politics. How can it be that every sample that has been tested so far has failed?
Well, this is a complicated business. Just to give you a bit of the background, all of these refurbishments are signed off under the building regulations. And the building regulations actually state, I think slightly different to what you reported just then, that any cladding used has to be of limited combustibility, not non-combustible. So the kind of cladding involved at Grenfell Tower was legal under the building regulations. Having said that, those regulations are quite complex. Now, the concern is that all of those samples will have been effectively passed by the building regulations, and now they are failing this new government test. Question is why. Now, it's quite possible the government test is much more tough than the sorts of certification processes that the cladding goes through before it is allowed to be used, and that's a testing regime that goes back decades. Right,
so as you say, there perhaps is now a new testing regime and this cladding has failed. That's because none of it had been tested since it had been fitted, because it was deemed OK the last time round.
That's right. Just to give you some example, or one example, we understand that the way that the testing is done, or has been done in the past, is to effectively test the heat resistance to the aluminium surface of the cladding, so the side of the cladding. Now, if you try and test the edge of it, where the plastic bit that's the sandwich filler, if you like, is exposed, then it is much more likely to burn. And it's quite possible these new government tests are testing that edge rather than testing the bit where the aluminium is protecting the middle bit of the sandwich, which is the bit that burns.
Now, it is complicated, as you say, but it can't just be about the cladding. I mean, I know there's a lot of focus on cladding too, but we've also talked about things like the sprinkler system. How much of a difference would that have made?
Well, just to answer the first point you made there, it's not going to be just about the cladding. I think that's pretty certain. Some experts are suggesting that the design of the cladding system around the tower had a part to play, for example, creating that chimney chimney effect you talked of, very important indeed, and I think that will be highlighted more as we go into the weeks to come. On sprinklers, a sprinkler system turns a building not into a passive fire safety system where effectively the fire burns out in one flat and doesn't spread, that's the theory, but it enables you to effectively put the sprinkler on, say, in one flat and evacuate the whole building, or even evacuate the whole building with the sprinkler system going. So it's a different type of safety system. But according to the information the government's given to councils, there is one importance of a sprinkler system. They say if you have cladding that is questionable, may burn in fires, if you also have a sprinkler system, then you have a lot less to worry about. I'm paraphrasing a little bit there, but that's basically what the advice to councils at the moment is.
Right, Tom Simons, thank you very much for bringing us up to date on that. Obviously, we'll be hearing much more about it as the inquiry gets underway. But Stephen Crabb, every single piece of cladding taken for testing failed fire safety tests. Do you agree there has been a catastrophic failure of building and health and safety regulations over years?
Absolutely. I mean, it's shocking that every single piece of cladding that they've been testing in recent days has come back as a fail. Now, this, as we've just heard, this is an extremely complicated issue, but nobody should lose sight of the human element to this. You know, we house the poorest people in the country in tower blocks that are clad with a material that can go up in flames like that. And there's a reason why we've appointed a judge-led public inquiry to investigate what happened. But I think we can all predict that when we get to the end of this inquiry and find out exactly what's gone on over a period of years in different parts of the country, we will never go back to doing things how they were.
In terms of evacuating residents, we've heard numerous stories now, not just from Camden Council, but other councils that decided not to evacuate their residents because they feel tower blocks are safe. Do you agree and do you sympathise with councillors who are saying we just need to get residents out of tower blocks that we think may be a risk?
I think Camden Council must have had really good reasons for deciding to start to evacuate people at 8:30 on a Friday night. I don't think that's an easy decision to take, and we don't know the detail, but there clearly were a number of factors at work there, and the advice must have been pretty overpowering. I mean, I think what we're witnessing is two things. If you can stand back a bit from it. One is, and you know, the Labour government is probably as guilty as the Conservative government. We've all run away from regulation. We've tried to deregulate. We've run away from inspection. And we've created, actually, clearly, dangerous structures. Every single one found to be dangerous. That is shocking. And I think what this has also come to symbolise for me is the inequality in society, that you put poor people into housing and you don't spend enough money on ensuring their safety and well-being. And that's a scandal that we should never allow to recur.
Do you think it's right, then, to point the finger of blame at anyone until we know the full facts?
Well, no, we need to know the full facts. I do think with Kensington and Chelsea, if you can go back to the initial one here, the idea that money was an issue there is not the case. I mean, they had, you know, 250 million or something like in balances. They gave their richest residents, those paying the highest council tax, £100 back as a bribe in the run-up to the election. They had the money to make sure they put in first-class insulation.
Some of the claims that we heard in the hours and days following that tragedy, from some in your own party, certainly some of the more aggressive online supporters of your party, were pointing the finger at Conservatives, at capitalism, at all kinds of reasons.
I don't go to that, Steve.
And the truth is that for decades, and you've admitted it, Labour-run councils up and down the country have, it would appear from the tests that we've been carrying out, have been using the same kind of cladding. So we should show a bit of humility here.
Actually,
let's not engage in...
Hang on a minute. What I actually said was Labour government. I think both the Labour government, I'm not blaming the councils, I think both the Labour government and the coalition government and the Conservative government have always prioritised deregulation and money saving, and we got it wrong. And I think in Kensington, what was particularly distressing there was any suggestion that money was an issue was obviously not.
So, Margaret Hodge, do you think this is fair? Let's have a listen to the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, who made this remark at Glastonbury.
Is democracy working? It didn't work if you were a family living on the 20th floor of Grenfell Tower. Those families, those individuals, 79 so far, and there'll be more, were murdered by political decisions that were taken over recent decades. The decision not to build homes and to view housing as only for financial speculation rather than for meeting a basic human need, made by decisions made by politicians over decades, murdered those families.
Do you agree, Margaret Hodge, with John McDonnell saying that the victims of Grenfell Tower fire had been murdered by political decisions over decades?
I agree we should listen to the tenants, and we clearly didn't there. I disagree with the language, and I think that is language of the hard left, which is not done in my name.
Should it be retracted?
I think it was inappropriate. I think where David Lammy is talking about corporate manslaughter, there may well be, we'll have to see how the facts come out, there may well be a case of corporate manslaughter, but that's a very different way of doing it than what John McDonnell said.
So you say not in your name, it's the language of the hard left. They are the ones leading and running your party. They own your party now. They are your party.
They don't own our party, and as a Democratic Party, I'm expressing a different view.
Right. Do you think he should retract those comments? I mean, we've had Portsmouth City Council Deputy Leader Luke Stubbs says that John McDonnell should withdraw the amazing comments. He said that Grenfell residents were murdered. But there is an awful lot of anger about, isn't there?
I think people on the right and on the left have got every reason to feel angry about what happened in that tower block. As I said a few moments ago, it's an awful human tragedy that's happened, and there will be people held to account for it when we complete the investigation. But the kind of language that we've just heard from, and he is the Shadow Chancellor, is appalling. It achieves nothing. It's all about stoking up the venom of the hard left who want to see Jeremy Corbyn as a Prime Minister in Downing Street.
Don't use that as an excuse to take away from the seriousness of the issues that we're... Well, it is a little bit. I mean, you know, that was a remark made, I don't know, at an evening meeting somewhere, political meeting.
Was it Glastonbury?
That Glastonbury, OK. It was made at Glastonbury, not the most representative of...
But certainly very public. But actually, one of the...
Can weekend on the
Stephen
BBC.
Graham, just finally, though, the point that perhaps that Margaret Hodge was making is that these people didn't feel they had a voice.
No,
and they didn't actually get listened to by people. Yeah. And, of course, people may argue that it's tragedies like this that, sadly, give people a voice.
And you're talking about people whose perhaps command of the English language wasn't very good, talking about people who were actually unsure of their own immigration status in this country. So there's a lot of work that needs to go on our housing estates up and down the country to make sure that tenants do feel that they can come forward and speak with confidence.
Now, in the last hour, the government has announced that 75 high-rise residential buildings in 26 council areas around the country have failed fire tests. That amounts to every single building that's been checked so far. Local Government Secretary Sajid Javid says that 1,000 fire doors were missing from the Camden Tower blocks that have been evacuated. Meanwhile, the company which makes the cladding that's thought to have been used on Grenfell Tower has withdrawn the product. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons has the latest.
Aluminium cladding for smarter and cosier council flats. Well, that was the promise. Around the country, this was Billingham on Teesside, councils have been reduced to this, taking it off and sending it for testing, leaving residents concerned and confused.
They're not very happy about it, are they? They feel that it should have been put right in the first place.
When the shiny stuff is gone, this is what's left behind, along with a cladding crisis as councils try to understand if their residents are at risk. Many are having to introduce additional fire inspections under government guidance sent out last week, not least for reassurance.
It's frightening. It really frightened you. Well, it made you feel sick, really, just to think how it could happen like that.
But this is the legacy of the housing catastrophe 2 weeks ago. The tests are happening in secret so far at this research centre. Samples from 75 towers have been sent.
The combustibility test has 3 categories rated 1 to 3, and it is judged that cladding material in category 2 or 3 does not meet the requirements for limited combustibility in building regulations. I can also confirm to the House that so far, on that basis, all samples of cladding tested have failed.
But as far as anyone currently knows, this was cladding passed as safe by building inspectors. The building regulations are complex, but they start from a basic principle. The external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire. The question is how to meet that requirement. Well, there's another document, something called Approved Document B, which in a section which doesn't even mention cladding says materials used should be of limited combustibility, meaning they burn slowly. But even that's not straightforward, because designers can instead turn to two more documents, these two, which set out other ways components such as fire barriers can be added to cladding which does burn to reduce a fire, including using a desktop study to prove it's safe.
It may well be the case that the regulations and the related guidance need to be updated to take account of changing technology in the building industry. But secondly, we're concerned that the current regulations and guidance are not being applied and are not being enforced strictly enough.
Indeed, the Communities Secretary told the Commons today 1,000 fire doors were missing from the towers evacuated in Camden following safety concerns. The inquests into 4 more of the victims open today. A coroner will consider what contributed to their deaths, as will the police. The planned public inquiry will look at possible, much wider failings in public safety. Because the pain of the Grenfell tragedy goes deep. The family of 52-year-old Khadija Kaloufi held a funeral blessing for her today. She is just one among at least 79 victims. Tom Simons, BBC News.
3 days after hundreds of residents from 4 tower blocks in Camden in North London were asked to evacuate their homes, there's confusion about how and where they will be rehoused. Sophie Hutchinson has been speaking to some of them.
People continued packing up their flats today and moving out of the tower blocks on the Chalcot estate in North London. Some families have been found temporary accommodation, but others say they feel abandoned by the council with nowhere to go.
No response.
This resident has spent the past 2 nights in a hotel with his wife and 4 children, but they can't stay there tonight.
Yesterday I called the council that my stay in the hotel is running out tomorrow. Find us, a solution. What are you going to do? And all I hear, oh, we're looking at your case, we will find you something, hopefully. What the hope is this? I don't understand what the hope is this.
This is the hotel room the family of 6 slept in last night, filmed by their daughter. Today, staff told them to leave. Fahim is hoping he may have found a flat for tonight, but when we left him, it still wasn't confirmed.
Now we feel as victims. We are victims because we have been evacuated. We are homeless. We are on the streets. This is my anger towards those who are responsible.
The Swiss Cottage Leisure Centre is where those families with nowhere to go have been sleeping. One of the residents captured the conditions inside on his mobile phone. People from 4 of the 5 tower blocks on the Chalcot estate have been told to leave because of safety fears over gas pipes, fire doors and cladding.
Here it is, just up there.
Oh, those are the 2 panels that they've taken away?
Yes.
Saeed Mir has refused to leave the flat where he lives with his wife and disabled mother because he says he's not been offered a realistic alternative.
Offering us a 1-bedroom disabled access facility about 3 miles away, northwest 10, but 1 bedroom with 2 beds, so it means me and my partner, my wife, sharing a room with my mum for 1 month, and no.
Safety checks were underway at the blocks today. The numbers refusing to leave have increased, and Camden Council is appealing for cooperation. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News.
Well, now the fallout from the Grenfell Tower fire has continued, with the number of high-rise blocks failing fire safety checks rising, as you've heard, to 75. Every single residential block that has now been tested has failed. It has also emerged that in Camden, where 4 blocks were evacuated, more than 1,000 fire doors were missing. And the US company that manufactured the cladding used on Grenfell Tower has stopped selling it altogether for use on high-rise blocks. Tom Clark has this report.
On high-rise buildings from Merseyside to Devon, the cladding is coming off. Of the 75 high-rise buildings whose materials have been tested so far, all 75 of them have failed flammability tests. The decision by many local authorities to chuck it in the bin and start all over. Others don't really know what to do yet.
We're all, in a sense, making this up as we go along because we've got to. We're in uncharted territory. It's a huge job. I mean, it's massive.
A job which falls to Community Secretary Sajid Javid, not only responsible for making the nation's high-rise buildings safe, but establishing why Grenfell Tower burned and seeing it never happens again.
We have witnessed a catastrophic failure on a scale many thought impossible in 21st century Britain. It is clear that failure must be understood, it must be rectified without delay, and the government is determined to ensure that that happens.
The 75 towers already identified at risk are scattered across the country. At least 14 are located in London, including 5 in Camden alone. And today, the government ordered the search to extend beyond social housing to hospitals, schools and all public buildings. The key question for tens of thousands of people living in tall buildings with cladding up and down the country: are they safe? Some councils are fitting sprinklers on this new build in Norfolk. They're tightening fire safety measures while they decide whether the cladding can stay. Following the nationwide cladding investigation, it was Camden Council here in North London that first took the decision to evacuate residents from these 4 tower blocks. But it wasn't just because of the cladding on the outside of them. When they started to look inside those buildings, they found several other fire safety issues that were of serious concern. As they tested key firefighting equipment in the towers today, it emerged 1,000 new fire doors will be needed to make these buildings safe. Not what you'd expect after a £150 million refurbishment, unless you're a fire safety expert.
If it's like other estates that I've seen, it's just years and years of renovations, losing sight of the fundamental fire engineering that goes behind making these buildings safe. These buildings were safe when they were built. If they were standing here behind us now as they were originally built, they'd still be safe, but they've been altered. And it's those alterations which have changed fundamentally the fire safety for residents in them.
So whoever's in charge of putting things right will have to make sure they don't make the problem worse. But the pressure is on to fix them quickly, especially for residents hastily moved out.
I'm in a bedsit. It's not even a bedsit, it's a room. I have 4 kids in one room. I'm sleeping on 2 single beds pushed together. My 2 kids are sleeping tail and tail. I'm sleeping with my 2-year-old next to me and the baby.
The testing programme for cladding is focusing solely on aluminium and plastic types. The company which made the product used on Grenfell Tower suspended global sales of it today for high-rise buildings. But there are many other products also used to clad buildings which, as we revealed last week, are just as combustible, if not more so. The effort to make cladded buildings safe is only just beginning.
Tom Clark reporting. Well, joining me now are Peter Rees, a planning officer for the City of London for 30 years, the Conservative MP Kevin Hunenrek, a member of the Commons of the Communities and Local Government Select Committee for 2 years, and Anne Cooper, a social housing resident and campaigner from South London. But let me start with you, Peter Rees, because you have fantastic perspective, 30 years, 29 years, I think, to be precise. But what has happened to building regulations, within which, of course, we also have to think about fire regulations too? What's gone wrong? I mean, was it privatisation?
Well, obviously, I was dealing with a parallel brand of regulation, which is town and country planning, applying it to the appearance of buildings and how they work and how land is used. But the building control system, which operates alongside of that, is the important protection of safety of buildings. And in the mid-80s, that system was partly privatised. Private certified inspectors were allowed to give building certificates for buildings and for work to buildings. Now, in many areas, like the City of London, this had little impact because people wanted the expertise of the local authority district surveyors team that had very specialised local local knowledge. In other parts of the country, the system was fragmented. And people went into the private sector, people became more mobile, they didn't stay in the local authority service and build up expertise over many years.
But was the driver for this cutting red tape? Was it about deregulation, if you please, or was it about getting a better system in some way?
I think, and this isn't a party political point, we are run by a country that is in the thrall of a treasury. The #1 ministry is the Treasury, and therefore it's the accountancy that always comes first. That's certainly the effect on...
So this was a money-saving basis, really?
Yes, the development industry will always say we can build more homes, we can do things faster and more effectively if only there was less red tape, if only there was less regulation. But the problem with that is that you don't have a fair balance between what is at the moment a tidal wave of investment into the country, causing huge amounts of development, and the need to ensure that we do the right thing.
Right. Well, I mean, this is a pretty shocking admission, really, that actually what really happened was deregulation because we basically saved money.
Well, we don't know where the problems have emanated from, to be honest, John. We need to look at this. But I think when we saw Grenfell, we thought, well, maybe that's an isolated case. But the fact that every single block that's been checked, there's a problem, is quite incredible. And also that there are 1,000 fire doors missing in Camden. I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong with the system. The system clearly has failed. We need to look at it properly, find out what's gone wrong, get some answers, find the solutions and make sure they're implemented.
But if you take fire safety, for example, there was a deliberate move in 2005 to take the fire brigade, the fire certification officers, out of all this and put it into other people's hands. I mean, we're going to have to see, presumably, a root and branch revolution.
I think that's absolutely right. The system has failed, but in 2016, Grenfell was inspected by the London Fire Brigade. There's something fundamentally wrong here, why this is happening. Maybe the rules are all too complicated. I don't know. I've been in business for 25 years before coming into politics. You can't tell me we're getting less regulation than we were before. There's lots of regulation about.
Well, Anne Cooper, in the midst of this morass, you face in your own borough the fact that your particular social housing area is to be renewed, possibly pulled down and another a tower block or something else put up. You must be full of alarm.
I think alarm is one word that we could use. I think another was distress. I think...
Do you feel that the people who are looking after you, and that is, after all, a borough, London Borough, really has any sense of safety and the requirements of the citizens?
What I would like to say is that when I first saw that footage of coming in of Grenfell Tower, my first thought was, they are like us, they are like us, they are like us. And I've had numerous conversations over the past 10 days where I've ended up weeping in the arms of other residents. That is how we are feeling about Grenfell. When it comes to we are being regenerated, and regeneration has become a dirty word, quite frankly.
Let me pause you there for a moment, because even what you've said raises the question of whether any development ought to be going on at all in terms of social housing at the moment, until we actually know what has gone wrong and what has to be put right, Peter.
Well, I don't think that's true. We can build an awful lot of social housing without building high-rise blocks, for instance. There's a misplaced belief that you increase density by building tower blocks. You don't, because the blocks are in the middle of a lot of waste land that can't really be used for amenity. If you build low-rise of up to 6 to 8 stories tall around smaller defensible spaces, you can achieve much higher density. That's what European and British cities have been doing for hundreds of years. It is the best model, and it doesn't come with the sort of dangers that we see in high-rise blocks.
What can you, Kevin, give Anne as comfort then? She's got 8 months before they start building.
And it must be very distressing to anybody who is in a tower block, who feels they're in this situation. But one thing I would say to anybody out there is that the regulations for very expensive apartments are exactly the same regulations as for social housing. I think the regulations may be wrong. It may be the way that we're implementing those regulations or overseeing them or enforcing them. And clearly something has gone catastrophically wrong.
Doesn't seem to have affected anybody living in rich housing.
Well, we haven't seen a fire in there yet, but that's not to say it couldn't happen.
Can I just make the point, actually, that, you know, I mean, we're talking about regulation, and I think that's absolutely right, that we should be talking about regulation. But the fact of the matter is, we've had 30 years of regulations being eroded, and they've been eroded to basically put people, to put profit before people. That's what's gone wrong here. And when it comes to the sort of regeneration schemes that are not new, there's nothing new about them. They've been going on for many years. It's the same practice, and I think John is absolutely right that regeneration schemes that are on the table at the moment should be stopped until we have a systematic and some sort of
but that begs the question, are you prepared to hang on where you are now until that's done?
We live in a beautiful estate. It's a low-rise estate. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. There's no reason why it should be regenerated in the first place. And I'm not the only one. I think something like 84% of our tenants agree with that.
We're going to have to pause it there. And Peter, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Peter Rees and Kevin Hollenrake, thank you very much indeed.
Now, while you're with us, this is our first opportunity to talk to you about the Grenfell disaster, because you're immigration minister now, and many of those people were immigrants. You used to be the housing minister, and you were also the fire minister. So, to what extent do you feel responsible for the catastrophic failure in the system to protect these people?
Well, we obviously have got an investigation ongoing with Grenfell. The Secretary of State for DCIG has been making a statement just this afternoon. We're all going to have to wait and see the details of what come through in that investigation. We all want to make sure that we learn the lessons of what's been in Grenfell. Now, I've not been in charge of building regulations in my roles in the past, but I was the fire minister. I spoke in that role in favour and outlined the importance and the benefits of sprinklers, in fact. But we've got to get to the bottom of exactly what happened there, how that fire not just occurred, but how it was able to spread, so that we can make sure that nothing like this can ever happen again.
Do you accept the system of inspection and regulation catastrophically failed?
Well, we haven't yet got to the details of exactly what went wrong in this building, and I'm not going to prejudge the outcome of that investigation. But we have got to make sure that nothing like this can happen again.
Mr. Lewis, 75 towers have failed inspections today. What do you need before you'll accept the system has failed?
Well, that's exactly the point I'm making. We've got to get to the bottom of not just what happened in Grenfell, but what is happening more widely.
The system has failed. I do not need, and neither do you, an official report to tell you the system has failed when thousands of people are being evacuated from their homes, thousands more are being told that the buildings they live in, which they were told were safe, have now failed fire safety inspections. Why can you not accept that the system has failed?
Well, we do need to get to the bottom of exactly what has happened in those buildings, why that cladding, if that is cladding that is a breach of building regs, and we haven't got to the bottom.
I asked you, why can't you accept that the system has failed?
That until the investigation is answered, can't be answered yet, because we don't know exactly what the issue is.
It's staring you in the face.
Well,
what do you need a report for?
You are prejudging an investigation that hasn't happened yet.
I'm saying when 75 towers have failed inspections today that were passed years ago, that is a failure. That is not something you need a report to tell you is a failure.
And as I've already said to you, we do need to get to the bottom of why these buildings were able to have products on them that do, in these reports at the moment, look like they were in breach of building regulations. And that is something we've got to do to make sure that this cannot happen again.
I mean, do you have any sense that that had anything to do with you?
Well, we haven't seen the investigation yet. We've got to get to the bottom of exactly what went wrong with this tragedy, what caused the fire, what allowed it to spread in the way it did, so we make sure this cannot happen again, that we understand why and how it happened in the first place.
Brandon Lewis, thank you very much.
Now, on something else complicated, with so much speculation about whether the cladding spread the fire at Grenfell Tower, you might have thought sales of the panels would have been stopped some time ago. But no, though the manufacturer did finally suspend sales of them today. And all this on the day the number of high-rise blocks to fail safety tests reached 75 out of 75. There are still hundreds more to be tested.
Across the country, tower blocks are being examined as concern and confusion about safety grows. Today, the company which made the panels used at Grenfell halted all sales for use in high-rise buildings. In a statement, they said, "We believe this is the right decision because of the inconsistency of building codes across the world and the code compliance of cladding systems."
We have witnessed a catastrophic failure on a scale many thought impossible in 21st century Britain. It is clear that failure must be understood, it must be rectified without delay, and the government is determined to ensure that that happens.
The first letter says your safety is our priority, just to calm the residents down.
But not enough has been done to reassure this resident who lives high up in a tower where cladding will be removed. She lives in one of the 75 tower blocks tested so far whose cladding has failed safety tests. There's still more than 500 to go. Sonia can remain, but she's scared.
I've been told that compared to Grenfell Tower, we are safer, but I still feel very unsafe being on the 13th floor.
There's a sense here that no one's really got enough grip on this unfolding situation, and that the more that's investigated, so the more unanswered questions there are about safety standards and regulations. Everywhere, residents are getting conflicting messages. In this Merseyside block, they've found combustible cladding, but the residents can stay.
It's quite upsetting, actually, quite frightening, because we weren't sure what was happening.
I've actually asked them to move, so I'm waiting for them to find me a place to go and move to.
And in Norwich, this block also failed cladding safety tests.
It's horrible. It's scary, because everyone matters.
And there are also financial implications, putting so much right in so many high-rise blocks.
It's how tall is the tower block is the problem, and how extensive the damage is beyond that, the actual structure of the building itself. But you're certainly talking of not less than £1 million a block.
12 days have passed since Grenfell, 12 days of soul-searching and scrutiny. But still, there don't appear to be consistent solutions to the concerns that have come in its wake. Penny Marshall, News at 10, North London.
Well, this evening, the government made clear that any cladding that fails the test breaks building regulations. Our political correspondent Paul Brand joins us from Westminster, where MPs are debating the fire. Paul, if we know that the cladding wasn't compliant with building regulations, the obvious question is, what on earth was it doing up on so many buildings?
Yeah, and Tom, I think that is a question that MPs will be raising here tonight. Today we did get a little bit closer, I think, to the answer, actually. It looks increasingly like it's not necessarily the regulations themselves that are the problem here, but the way they are enforced, how this cladding ever managed to slip through the system. We know, of course, that all of the samples currently being tested at a lab run by an independent company called BRE are failing. Tests a little bit like this one on your screens now, but we also know they are testing them against the same standards, the same benchmark that has always existed. So the question is, how are they failing now when they were allowed through in the first place? Today the government said it will set up this independent advisory panel on fire safety. I understand tonight this is one of the first issues that panel will look at, how these panels ever went from fine to failure.
OK, Paul, but we're told also that the government, received reassurances relatively recently that their building regulations, that the building regulations were accurate and reasonable enough. So that in itself raises a whole bunch more questions, does it not?
Yeah, so the same company that's currently testing these panels actually advised the government in a report last year that it thought regulations were adequate. BRE did say, watch out, there is more of this flammable product being used on tower blocks, but they said, with the exception of 1 or 2 unfortunate but rare cases, there is currently no evidence from these investigations to suggest that the current recommendations to limit vertical fire spread up the exterior of high-rise buildings are failing in their purpose. We've tried to call BRE tonight to have a bit more of a chat about this. We can't get through to them at the moment, but one former housing minister said to me today all the advice he was getting from civil servants was the regulations are good enough. Of course, now that advice seems devastatingly off the mark, potentially.
OK, Paul, hopefully we'll get to the bottom of it eventually, but for now, thank you very much. So what action is being taken around England as a whole? As we've seen, many authorities are removing cladding. In addition to Barnet, a further 8 councils in London are doing so, along with Plymouth, Portsmouth, Salford and Sunderland. Sprinklers are to be retrofitted in areas including Birmingham, Nottingham and Croydon. In Liverpool, they are looking at drawing up an at-risk register for vulnerable people who may need extra help in case of a fire, while the most extreme action has been taken in Camden, where the council told people to leave at-risk blocks, although not everyone has done so.
Taplow House in Camden is just one of the 600 tower blocks across the country now at the centre of safety concerns. The council is trying to get everybody out, but there are some who are unwilling or unable to leave. Lulu Cummings is a single mother who's been forced to move into a hotel. Our cameras are not allowed inside, but we were able to film on a mobile phone.
Stuff's going to be off in there now, ain't it?
As she empties the fridge and prepares to leave.
Horrible, very distressed. My anxiety's gone through the roof. So I rang Camden, I've asked them, I was like, you need to tell me what's going on. I've got anxiety, 2 children, panic attack after panic attack. It should have been more organised. If this is how unorganised it is, here, imagine what it was like when Grenfell happened. See? If you look under here, look at the massive gap.
And news this evening that 1,000 fire doors are missing from these tower blocks is no surprise to Lulu.
Cover the breeze that comes in.
But that would let smoke in if there was a fire.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Lulu's story is just one of some 3,000 individual cases here in Camden alone. Across the country, the figure is far higher, and none of these people know exactly when they'll be able to move back home. But the council has defended its handling of the evacuation.
We had to act. I know it's been so difficult, and I'm having those same conversations, and we're just doing everything we can now to match people to the right accommodation.
But Lulu is now in a tiny hotel room with 2 children.
Definitely don't want to bring them in Taplow. I don't want to bring them here either. But, you know, you feel like you don't have a choice.
A cramped space which you'll have to put up with for weeks. Some, though, have decided not to leave these towers. Their lights a sign of defiance for residents who can't face the upheaval. Dan Rivers, News at 10, North London.
Well, as for the victims of the fire in West London, we learned a little more today about how 4 of those lost their lives at the opening of their inquest. In the case of 5-year-old Isaac Paulus, it was from breathing in fumes. He lived on the 18th floor. His body, identified from dental records, was found on the 13th. Early investigations suggest the artist, Khadija Say, died from fumes and burns. Her mother from fumes alone. Their bodies were found on different floors. Miss Say on the 9th, her mother 4 floors higher on the 13th. The body of Mohammed Noor Tuku, who probably also died from fumes, was found outside the building, close to a nearby leisure centre.
The government has confirmed today that samples of aluminium panels from all 75 buildings that had been sent for fire retardancy testing had so far failed. Every single one. And tonight, Newsnight can reveal how the organisations tasked with enforcing building regulations are in fact helping contractors to get around the rules. The revelations point to a systemic failure of the very structures put in place to try and keep our buildings safe. Our policy editor, Chris Cook, is with me now and can talk us through. What have you found, Chris?
So the big thing to understand here is that the government has written a big set of regulations that cover tall buildings, and they set out one very simple rule, really, as far as we're concerned, with cladding is the big issue around Grenfell Tower. Specifically, they said that basically everything you bolt to the outside of a building has to meet basic fire safety tests. They have to be of grade, we're going to use some jargon here, A2. And what A2 means is it has to be either limited combustibility or better, not combustible at all. What we found is that the building industry has been writing guidelines to assist builders as they interpret these rules. And often these guidelines actually don't just say these are the minimum standards and help get round, help deal with that. They often effectively allow you to go beneath those standards. So, for example, we've revealed tonight in a film we're about to see a problem, a vulnerability in the regulations arising from the fact that one of the major bodies that enforces building regulations has written a rule set that says, we know the government says that A2 is the standard of material that you're usually required to put in a tall building, but you know what? If you use B category cladding and B category insulation, that is to say stuff that is less fireproof than the minimum standard allowed by the government, that's going to be fine. We'll sign that off. That's quite troubling, and actually it points to a larger problem, and it helps explain why so many of these buildings are now failing fire tests. I've made a film that helps explain some of these issues more fully.
Cladding is starting to come off buildings across England because it's not to code. In Islington, the external panels of this council-owned property are coming down already because they were deemed insufficiently fireproof by an official government test. And they're hardly alone.
I can inform the House that as of midday today, the cladding from 75 high-rise buildings in 26 local authority areas has failed the combustibility test.
The government's official building regulations are set out in something called Approved Document B. And what that says is that insulation products attached to the outside of buildings of more than 18 metres tall must meet stringent fire standards. Specifically, they must be of materials that are either non-combustible or of very limited combustibility. In the jargon, they must be of grade A2 or better. That is what these tests are all about. How then can it be that buildings have been fitted with cladding that doesn't meet that requirement? Building inspectors don't always rely directly on the rules set by the government. The inspectors, who these days are largely privately employed, use guidelines to the rules written by professional bodies representing the sector.
It's been some time since the relevant regulations were updated, and the industry has to keep up with changing technology, changing customer demands. It has to turn to its specialists, to consultants for advice on these issues, because it can't depend on the regulations alone.
These sector guidelines actually allow builders to get insulation or cladding that doesn't meet the A2 standard past inspectors, for example, via a so-called fire test. So you rig up your proposed cladding as it would be used and then see what happens when it's exposed to fire. If the system as a whole performs well, then it's signed off, even if individual parts would fail on their own. So some of the cladding failing tests right now may have been rigorously tested as part of a system. There are, though, rather less rigorous routes.
If no actual fire test data exists for a particular system, the client may instead submit a desktop study report from a suitable body stating whether, in their opinion, combustibility criteria would be met.
That's guidance from the Building Control Alliance, the BCA, a body representing the great and good of building. Builders can use data from old tests to get combustible materials signed off in new scenarios without doing any further fire tests. This opaque process is a vulnerability in the compliance process. Newsnight, though, has found another weakness in the regulation. This is a piece of guidance from the NHBC, a sector body and a major supplier of building inspectors. And what it says is that rather than everything needing to be A2, you can use B-grade cladding and B-grade insulation material without even needing a desktop study. That is because, they say, there have been so many desktop studies and so many fire tests. In essence, they've decided that the government's rules are too strict. NHBC said that this guidance was issued
on the basis of NHBC having reviewed a significant quantity of data from a range of tests and desktop assessments.
They also stressed that thorough assessments by their inspectors haven't allowed the use of plastic cord cladding, such as that used at Grenfell under this guidance. Earlier tonight, though, we learned that one of the insulation products they propose using with B-grade cladding is actually C-grade insulation. This guidance takes us a long way from A2.
There's a world of interest.
So does it much matter legally that builders follow sector guidelines, not government rules? Well, yes, but in the event of a civil case, the sector guidelines would matter.
Yes, it does, because breach of the regulations will be very strong evidence in a civil claim against a builder. However, in the absence of up-to-date regulations, in the absence of clarity, then general guidance, compliance with general guidance could also be a defence.
So the building codes are a mess, and the government is slow to update its regulations. But had contractors just stuck with them, they would now be pulling less cladding off high-rises.
Chris Cook reporting there, and David Lammy is the Labour MP for Tottenham. He lost a friend, the artist Khadija, in the fire at Grenfell. At the weekend, he claimed on social media that the published estimate of 79 deaths in the fire is far, far too low, and that a failure to provide updates of the true number that died is feeding suspicion of a cover-up among survivors and local residents. I asked him earlier if he himself believed the authorities were withholding information.
The 79 figure, which has now stood for a week, does not accord with those who live down there and say, but the survivors, and there's a gap. They know there's a gap. In one flat alone, people say there were up to 40 people gathering because they gathered in the flat. It was Ramadan. There are lists you can use. DWP lists for those who are on benefits. There's a local school, and for the local authority you can assess how many kids have showed up for school or not showed up for school. You can use mobile phones. You can speak to the mobile phone. They will assist. I saw this during the riots. Who's been on their phone at 12 o'clock before the fire started? There are ways in which you can assemble lists of people and numbers.
Are you suspicious of a cover-up?
When you have tragedies of this kind that could have been prevented. We know from Hillsborough and other affairs in our national life that governments, local authorities, big corporations, companies, the contractors, they cover their backs, and that's why I raised issues around the documentation. Have the police seized documents yet? In this case, we know nothing about whether that's happened. And that it doesn't really matter what I think, it matters what people on the ground think.
It does matter what you think because you are a well-known local MP. You've, for example, tweeted that dozens of people, residents or dozens of people, jump from windows, and nobody has talked about more than 10. Nobody has found more than that outside. So who do you think is lying there?
Emily, I am being honest about what people have said to me. Let's validate those people. Journalists take cameras down. They too have spoken to people. This is what they say. I was not standing outside of Grenfell Tower watching my neighbours jump and burn to death. But I've heard those people, and we should validate what they are saying. They're not making it up. If you're saying that I should say nothing, I'm afraid I disagree with you.
I'm just trying to get to the bottom of whether you actually think it's a cover-up, and if so, why would authorities be covering this up?
What people say is that if you put the numbers out early, there could be civil unrest. That's what they say.
And you think that's right, do you?
I've no idea. I'm not. You'd have to ask the police chief.
But I'm just saying, by repeating it and by tweeting it, you are giving people a sense that that is where you stand, that is what you believe. So,
I've told you I'm sympathetic to it. I'm going to walk alongside those people.
Do you think that K&C is trying to cover up the numbers? Let's just have that categorically.
I've got no idea. Ask Nick Paget-Brown.
Do you think that the police or the fire emergency services are covering up the number of people that jumped out of that tower on that night?
I wasn't there, but people on the ground say they saw more than is being suggested.
And do you think that the number of dead is not being revealed because you worry it will lead to civil unrest?
Well, the truth is the media cycle's now beginning to move on to other things. That's the truth. And so what people say is that, you know, in 2-3 weeks' time, if you start to reveal the numbers, things have moved on.
You could turn around and say, I understand how painful this is, I really do, but I also see it's complicated. You know better than I do that some of the homes were sublet. Some people have not been as happy to come forward, even if they have survived, even if they know people have survived.
This is the 6th richest economy in the world. If we have not assembled the list of the landlords in the building, then what the hell are we capable of doing? You know, where is the register? If we can't put together a benefits list, a schools list, ask local hospitals, GPs, who also have their list.
But that is what they're trying to do, isn't it? That's what they're trying to do.
I've not heard that communication from government. If you have, then
so is it
thanks
that
for
you just
enlightening me,
need
but I
to
haven't
hear
heard
them
it.
saying we're doing this now? Presumably that is the work that's going on behind the scenes, isn't it?
Well, I'm saying I'm afraid you can't presume. People need to hear it.
David Lammy, thank you. Minister, just while we have you here, you were, of course, the Housing Minister and the Fire Minister as well. As we reflect on the lessons to be learnt from the Grenfell fire, as Housing Minister in 2014, you said that building developers should not be forced to fit sprinklers. Your department declined to bring in regulation that would force them to fit sprinklers. Why?
Well, actually, that's not correct. First of all, I wasn't the Housing Minister at the time of that speech, and I'm not an expert on building regulations because I was never the Minister responsible for building regulations. That speech was when I was the Fire Minister, and that speech was actually a speech that I made in favour of sprinklers, and I actually was outlining the importance and the benefits that sprinklers can bring. What I was actually saying was that there are a whole range of fire safety measures out there. There's a whole range of different types of fire sprinkler systems out there. It's not for the government to choose a particular system. It's up to building owners, whether it is a social housing owner in a high-risk building or in a commercial high-risk building or a high-rise or a low-density building, to look at what is appropriate, because they have a duty of care to people in their buildings.
Did you not say the cost of fitting a fire sprinkler system may affect house building, which is something we want to encourage, so we must wait to see what impact?
Well, yeah, exactly. And what I was saying was, obviously, we want to make sure we're building more houses. New build homes, of course, actually have been increasing over that period of time and have more increasing levels of fire safety. Indeed, we brought in the requirement to have smoke detectors, for example, for private landlords.
Is it not conceivable that some of those decisions which came under your department's either in fire or housing, could have been taken very differently. Do you not have regrets about the kind of decisions that were taken then?
I think any of us who have been involved in politics from when these buildings were built in the 1960s, the 1970s through to today will be looking at what went wrong with Grenfell, what can we do to make sure this never happens again.
You spoke about regulation. You said in our commitment to be the first government to reduce regulation, we've introduced the 1 in, 2 out rule for regulation. Your culture then was about cutting red tape, and that was the kind of red tape we now see could have saved lives.
Well, it's a matter of looking at regulation right across government, not just around these issues. We'll all be wanting to learn the lessons from what happened at Grenfell to make sure this can never happen again. This shouldn't have been able to happen. We don't know exactly why it happened yet. We've got to get to the bottom of that.
Brandon Lewis, thank you.